Laudato Si has already become, as most observers have underlined already,
Your mic
sort
will...
of a landmark.
Professore, il microfono, per favore.
Sorry? Does not work? Yeah, it was work. As I said, Laudato Si has already become a sort of a landmark and a new path towards tackling the problems, which gives the title to this seminar. Now, to simplify, I detect three main theses which are vigorously defended in the document by the Pope. The first thesis says that the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together, to use his own words. And he adds, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental, unquote. Now, this is a new thesis, because in the literature, until recently, we found that the field contrasted by the so-called extreme environmentalist on one side and the anthropocentric attitude on the other side. Let me read, I discovered a sentence by a philosopher, Stephen Pastel, of 20 years ago. I quote from him, which I found revealing. Pastel wrote, "The world economic system seems incapable of confronting at the same time the problem of poverty and that of environmental protection. To treat the ecological ills of the earth separately from the problems linked to situations of indebtedness, trade imbalances, inequalities in levels of income and patterns of consumption is like seeking to heal a cardiac illness without combating the patient's obesity and his rich diet of cholesterol," unquote. Now, that is a sentence of almost 20 years ago. And I have to say that this encyclical, Laudato Si, in a sense tries to give more emphasis to the necessity of not separating the two sides of the same coin. This, of course, has major implication at the practical level. For instance, today some people started talking about climatic inequality, which is a new type of inequality, to which until recently we've never been accustomed. It seems that 70 million inhabitants of the planet emit 100 tons of greenhouse gases per capita per year, as much as the over 3 billion poorest persons who are most impacted by climate disruption. Even the other day, I believe the UN had produced a document in this regard. So this raises the issue of what I said, climatic inequality. A second practical implication is the fact that it's not enough to consider the production of, say, different types of CO2, CF4, which is different, as the scientist taught us, from CO2, because CF4 is much more dangerous than CO2. But it's also important to consider the consumption. In other words, it makes little sense to evaluate a nation on the basis of the CO2 production by its companies, if one does not also consider how much its consumption and the lifestyles of its inhabitants impacts the environment. For example, today the Chinese emit the equivalent of 6 tons of CO2 per year per person, compared to 13 tons for Europeans and over 22 tons for North Americans. And so the point is, should we also include in the agenda of the COP22 next month, or something like that, an item of this sort, because otherwise it seems to me that it's impossible to reach an agreement between the so-called countries of the north and the countries of the south of the world. This is, as I said, the first important thesis which we can extract from the document. The second thesis is the statement according to which the ecosystem is a global common good. Again, that is a novelty, because the Pope says that the ecosystem is neither a private good nor a public good, but it is a common good. Now, we know, economists know very well, that until recently, the proposal stemming from economic theory was the application in one way or the other of the famous Coase theorem by Ronald Coase, 1960, when he produced this paper. Now, we know that the Coase theorem could produce good results if the good under consideration is a public good. But if it is a common good, and the ecosystem is a common good, produces degenerations, as we are observing, etc. In other words, it is the so-called tragedy of commons that is not a mere fact that Harding, when in 1968 he published his fundamental or well-known paper, The Tragedy of Commons, he was not an economist, he was a biologist. And he was perhaps the one who opened the eyes to the economy, saying, you cannot continue to treat a common good as if it were a public good, or even worse, a private good. We need a new type of governance structure, because the governance for the public goods is qualitatively different from the governance of a common good. And on this, the Encyclical Laudato Si has written something, in my opinion, very important in this regard. Now, the third thesis has to do with the necessity that of the so-called economic biodiversity. Now, if biodiversity is a value in the natural world, it's also a value in the economic arena, in the economic world. What does it mean, economic biodiversity? It means that the market should be conceived as an arena where different types of companies or agents should operate, not only one type. That is a limitation, a reductionist stance. Nowadays we talk about for-profit enterprises, which is okay, but we talk about benefit corporations. Americans were the first to introduce, 6 years ago, for the first time, at the legal level, this new figure, which is called benefit corporation. We have social enterprises, we have NGOs. NGOs today do not only perform advocacy purposes, but they are real economic agents, because they generate and produce value, etc. Why economic biodiversity is important? Because it seems to me that it's the only important way to contrast the concentration of economic power. It is not something new. Everybody understands that today the process of monopolizations and the oligopolistic markets are dominating the figure. And that goes against the basic principles of economics, because economists in general, they always preach the virtue of perfect competition. Now, today, there is no perfect competition, even imperfect competition. The process of monopolization, again, it's very critical, because those who have economic power tend to transfer this power to the political arena, and then the circle gets closed. So, on this front, what should be done? First of all, financing the ecological transition. Now, today we talk about the green economy and the blue economy, as well as a circular economy versus the so-called model of linear economy of the past. But as we know, we need, big money to allow this transition from the usual way of organizing the productive process and this new type. Now the question is, Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. We know, as the recent estimates have taught us, that at the world level, the total amount of derivatives plus financial assets amounts to $700,000 billion. $700,000 billion. And of this amount, only 7% is utilized to finance the real side of the economy, to finance families, to finance entrepreneurs, etc. So why not modifying, even modestly, certain rules of the financial game, in order to transfer a part, a certain percentage of this big amount to finance what is called the ecological transition. It seems to me that that would be really an important element to be put in the COP22 agenda. A second practical implication is the necessity, in my opinion, irreversible, to give way to what is called a World Environmental Organization. Now, we have created the World Trade Organizations. We have many other types of similar organizations. Why not creating a World Environmental Organization? Why such an organization today is necessary? It is necessary because in the absence of such an organization, the World Trade Organization, perhaps in bona fide, tends to apply certain rules or certain procedures which are detrimental to the cause of, let's say, environment protection, etc. But there is a second important purpose to be attributed to a World Environmental Organization, namely to intervene in all those cases in which price signals fail to anticipate irreversible environmental losses. And finally, another important, let's say, duty would be to cope with the problem of the eco-refugees. The eco-refugees is a serious problem. Today, in particular, not in North America, but in Europe, we are afflicted by the migratory flows. But a recent research by the UNHCR tells us that by 2050, if nothing has been done, we run the risk of having 250 million people displaced from their own countries because of the climate change, the level of the sea increasing, etc. So to conclude, I would like to conclude with 50 years ago, Lynn White, the historians, published an important, in my opinion, paper where he wrote, I quote, "What people do about their ecology depends on what they think about themselves in relation to things around them. Human ecology is deeply conditioned by beliefs about our nature and destiny, that is, by religions." Now, it is important that this aspect was taken in an indirect way by the Pope in Laudato Si, because it proves that the role of religions, different types of religions all over the world, can play, in my opinion, an important role. And that perhaps is a way to vindicate an anticipation that Teilhard de Chardin made a long time ago when he said, "All creatures advance with us and through us towards the common good." Thank you very much.